in the country of Germany. Okay. All right. From a global perspective, it is not so in many other parts of the world. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, there are growing churches. The Masoretic Christos Church in Ethiopia is over 500,000 and growing at about 10% a year, which makes them much larger than the Mennonite Church USA. In 1993, I worshiped in the capital city, Addis Ababa, where they had a building at that time that held what they said was 7,000 Ethiopians, and then they smiled and said, and 5,000 Americans. Another large Mennonite church is in Semarang in Indonesia, perhaps even bigger than the one in Ethiopia. So in the past 60 years, the continent of Africa has gone from 9% to 44% Christian. So the trends are not the same in various parts of the world. One of the persons who I only became acquainted with in the last several months is Diana Butler Bass. She has a book entitled Christianity After Religion. The librarian at Goshen Public Library says that's a curious title. She observes that we live in a time of momentous historical change. The culture has shifted in many ways from social obligation to personal choice. We make many more personal choices, and this impacts, of course, what we think about religion. She observes that atheism has not increased. It's only at about 1.6%. There are 4 atheistic organizations. They struggle, compete for resources, and are not doing very well as organizations. But the phrase spiritual but not religious, that is a big catchphrase. A lot of people. Now, there are 4 possibilities. You could be spiritual and religious. You could be not spiritual, but religious. Or you could be religious and not spiritual. So she is saying the spiritual but not religious is a very popular phrase. Now, she looks at this as having some positive elements. She says a lot of people are looking for new paths, new understandings. They're switching denominations. Only 44% of us are still in the same denomination we started with. She herself went from Methodist to Episcopal. We are also doing a lot of religious borrowing from each other, and especially in prayer practices. Many Protestants are acquainted with Lectio Divina, or contemplation, meditation, centering prayer. Now, when she thinks about the possibility that we are really in an awakening, that idea has not caught on. How many of you have heard of the idea that we may be in a religious awakening in America? It takes a little imagination to think of that, but let's hear her case. First of all, just as a bit of religious history, we had 3 religious awakenings, of which there's no question. 1730 to 1760, this is before our nation was formed, colonial days, and then the leading ministers were Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, and then in 1800 to 1830, a few decades before the Civil War, Charles Finney, and then 1890 to 1920, such worthies as Dwight L. Moody, Billy Sunday, and it included both a kind of social gospel protest against child labor and against the horrible conditions for women in those factories in that time. And it was also the birth of Pentecostalism. So there is various currents going there, but all of these led to quite a few new people attending church and becoming a part of Christianity. And each of these added thousands. And they were met with vigorous opposition. In the first one, the ministers who were seminary trained were scandalized that with this rapid growth, you had a number of ministers that didn't have the proper training. And so you had a fierce opposition. And likewise, the other 2 awakenings. Some of them took over political parties, split churches, helped to elect political candidates. I'm talking about the first three now. And Bass claims that we had an awakening of new life in America starting about 1960, and then a very strong backlash between 75 and 95. And today the backlash is losing some of its energy. It's still there, still active, but it's losing some energy. And she thinks the awakening is resuming. The meaning of awakening now, according to her, people want to have a direct knowledge of God and not just knowledge about God. They stress relationships. They react against church structures, rules, an overemphasis on technique. There's a passion for justice, the prayer practice of contemplation, honoring interfaith connections, the wisdom of other world religions in a mutual quest for what God wants to do in this world. So the phrase spiritual but not religious is vague, but it often includes a mix of these themes. One of the purest examples of this, if you want to take a personality, is Jimmy Breslin of New York, the writer who's much published, and almost all of his books have to do with his beloved New York City. He lived 1928 and he died in 2017. He wrote a book in 2004, The Church That Forgot Christ. And it's a scathing analysis and response to the crisis of the priest abuse of boys and girls, and then the bishop's practice of moving them around to other parishes where they repeated the same kind of cruel exploitation of young people. And he decided at a certain point that, I might say he interviewed the victims, he interviewed the priests, he interviewed the bishops by name. The book was quite an expose and scandal. He said he continues to believe as a believing Catholic, but he cut all ties to the religious structures of Catholicism, withdrew his membership, was not going to Mass, gave no financial support, but said he is a believer. He's spiritual, but he's not religious in the sense of participating in that structure. The Catholics in 2017 did give him a funeral Mass. It was in the huge St. Patrick's Church of over 2,000 seats there. And when they had the time for the family to share, his son got up and said, "I don't think Dad would appreciate being here." Now, some of the backlash ideas against awakening, it comes out of a loyalty to the way things used to be, especially in the 50s, often motivated by fear. Often the greatest tension is among variations of the same religion. It could be deadly if you're the wrong kind of Islamic person opposed by other Islamic religionists. Often fear of women in leadership, fear of Islam, fear of homosexuals and transgender people. It includes scapegoating, immigrants and all outsiders. And of course, a big issue is unborn life. So those who are opposing a kind of awakening that she's describing have their very, very passionate issues. Now, not all leaders are or were on the same page, but Paige Patterson was very successful in taking over the Southern Baptist and pushing them rightward, managed to get new people appointed to boards of colleges and seminaries in the church itself. And then he was dismissed because of scandal from the church, from the Southern Baptists. Pat Robertson is now deceased. Jerry Falwell, moral majority, he's deceased. Political voices like Rush Limbaugh, deceased. Phyllis Schlafly, the Tea Party, got lots of publicity and for a time, millions of devoted followers. Some of that backlash continues, but sociologist Robert Putnam believes it peaked out in the 90s. Now, another summary of what Bass is referring to as New Awakening emphasizes relationships, practices, experiences that connect people to a deeper awareness of self, our global neighbors, and God, awareness of God's energy in the world, navigating across human barriers to find God. Bass recognizes that these emphases can sometimes go off into a kind of weird claim by somebody who says, well, God has spoken to me and this is the truth I believe. And she recognizes the value of church institutions to moderate some of these excesses. But she wishes that denominations and parachurch organizations would themselves be converted to better accommodate some of the hungers of the New Awakening. She also claims, and others would as well, that there is some awakening in the interfaith community. Now, I don't believe awakening describes all of the decline. Some decline is outright rejection of the Christian faith, especially when people in a religious context have been bullied, or they're reacting to church scandal, or they're passionately disagreeing with the church's treatment of LGBT people, and so forth. And some are just too busy. They have work, they have children to take to soccer games, and they just have sort of dropped out. Tim Keller, the late pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian in Manhattan, has some thoughts about these matters. He thinks that we have a problem with disordered love. He takes that from St. Augustine in the 4th century. He calls a disordered love a source of counterfeit gods. What we love most can be out of order. It's certainly right that we love our work and that we love our family. But if we love our work to the neglect and exclusion of our family, we have a disordered love or a counterfeit God. And he compares the results of that to something of the child sacrifice of the biblical times. He says, an idol will always break your heart. If your God is money and things, we can never get enough. If our God is power, we risk feeling afraid. If our God is being smart, we risk feeling stupid. If our God is a perfect body, we risk feeling ugly. A dramatic example that we can all relate to, suppose you have a world-class athlete with lots of fame and lots of money, and then they get injured or they retire. So they ask, well, who am I now? Summary of some of his thoughts. Created things that we make into a God have no capacity to forgive. Jesus, in our Christian tradition, forgave those who tortured and executed him. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And as Warren Buffett has pointed out in the stock market, you don't get forgiven if you know not what you do. We have lived through a time of the counterfeit gods of Hitler's Nazism, Stalin's communism, Mussolini's fascism. And today, there are the false gods of pleasure, nationalism, including Christian nationalism, and individualism. So his lesson is that as he tries to minister, he finds that there are false gods that need to be identified and debated with. Another consequence of religious decline is the rising cost of healthcare. You may remember that Harold Koenig, who spoke to Sojourner's class just a few Sundays ago, mentioned that Harvard School of Public Health is supplementing his work by trying to look at what it will mean as religion declines and as the support and good health effects of church membership are no longer there. What that will mean for insurance, what that will mean for Medicare, Medicaid. Now, other consequences of decline. We can't prove that some of these tragic developments of recent years are caused, but the association is striking. Deaths of despair are suicides, alcoholic liver disease, drug overdoses. In 1995, we had 65,000 deaths of despair. In 2018, there were 158,000 deaths of despair. And in 2022, we had over 100,000 people die of drug overdose alone, a lot of it by fentanyl. In recent decades, family structures have weakened dramatically. Another striking association with declining churches. In 1960, 9% of children were being raised in a one-parent family. Now it's 34% of children raised with just one parent. We've all read of David Brooks from time to time. He, in an article in this past August in the Atlantic, worries about what he calls American sadness. Those without close friends, they've increased fourfold since 1990. High school students with persistent sadness or hopelessness from 26% in 09 to 44% in 01. And rates of depression are rising. Dr. Vivek Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General, has warned about the health effects of widespread loneliness in America. And we think about Christianity at its best, and our wonderful hymn, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee, and our Christmas hymns that mention joy. And so much of that crucial to the Christian faith. We think of C.S. Lewis in his autobiography entitled Surprised by Joy. One of the expressions of sadness that I came to love when I was a student at Goshen College and a student of John Fisher is the poem Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. He lived in the 19th century. And he struggled to believe. He admired the faith of people like Browning, who was a forthright Christian and poet, but he became agnostic. And so he talks about the sadness associated with the decline of faith. I quote from his poem, Dover Beach. The sea of faith was once two at the fill, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its long, melancholy, long withdrawing, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. So he says, all love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And here we are, as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Could have been written yesterday. Well, are there some paths of renewal, of both spiritual and church renewal? I mentioned Tim Keller, a pastor in New York, the late Tim Keller. He was able to intensely listen to the young professionals of Manhattan and preached a gospel that addressed their anxieties as well as some of their idolatries. Cardinal Tim Dolan, one of the 11 red hats of the Catholic Church in America, was addressing some seminarians recently and said, if we just do the same things we did before, we're only tending a museum. Don't look to brick and mortar, look up to Jesus and out to his people. Russell Moore, pushed out of the Southern Baptists and now editor of Christianity Today, writes, we have an empty cross and an empty tomb. Our central message is the crucified and risen Christ and the invitation to join his kingdom. Both of these Catholic and Protestant leaders are saying back to basics. we've been distracted from what should be our central message. Diana Bass has something along this line too. She says when Jesus met with his disciples at the very first, he didn't say, go out and say, have faith, have faith. He said, follow me. First, they saw him respond to poor people, associate with disreputable people, heal the sick, proclaim forgiveness, preach the kingdom of God. And then he did these things with them. And then he sent them out to do those things. And after learning by following, the last step was faith in him as Messiah, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. But the first thing is to follow what he did. And so let's not get it backward. Our ultimate biblical claim for the church amidst the ups and downs of history are the words of Jesus. Upon this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So I invite your thoughts. Yes.
Awakening that happens every 500 years.
Oh, yes. I neglected to mention the three people that gave a very lavishly positive endorsement of this book were the Catholic Richard Rohr from the Center for Contemplation and Action in Albuquerque, Phyllis Tickle, Episcopalian, the deceased Phyllis Tickle, unfortunately, but she had a memorable phrase that the church has something like a rummage sale every 500 years. And in a rummage sale, you would sort of look at what you have, and it's too much, and you decide, well, this I could get rid of, and this I want to keep. So we're sort of in the midst of sorting things out like that in a rummage sale, according to Phyllis Tickle. And she would be a bit positive, like Diana. And then also Parker Palmer, who has been to this campus to speak and who often addresses both secular and religious audiences. He has a way of uttering some of the truths out of his Quaker tradition that do not offend secular audiences. So he has quite a demand for his services. He's officially retired. And all three of them say this is a message that we endorse, but it hasn't caught on, in a big way. A lot of people would argue with the idea of any kind of awakening going on. But I'm glad you mentioned Phyllis Tickle.
I wonder, Vic, if you could reflect upon what's happening within our own denomination. We merged with two of our outstanding brothers and sisters, and now we all are smaller than we were before the merge.
Yes. John Lennox was mentioning is inviting my reflections on how this might affect Mennonites, and he refers back to the history of our merger some time ago between the two largest Mennonite branches, and now together we are smaller than we were separately. And what does this kind of idea of awakening and decline mean for us? To me, there are certainly signs of awakening. I don't think we have in our denomination some of the fossilized structures as badly as some of the other denominations. We have all built into our structures a pretty high appetite for accountability. But, and I think if you pick up the Anabaptist world, there's so many inspiring stories of what people are doing in many parts of the world and the marvelous work of MCC and the like and the like. But clearly there are areas of our geography where the persons of pushback and heresy hunting are in full flavor, and that they do count. So I think we have something of both dynamics happening within our beloved denomination. In terms of our local church, we've had some decline, and then we've had dozens of people who choose to join us, who could join many other Mennonite churches in the community. So there's, I think, a push-pull dynamic there as well. If you want my particular bias and my stance, I'd like to be identified as both spiritual and religious, finding some of the spiritual ingredients of relationship and of commitment and some of the spiritual disciplines that come out of that tradition. And also, I am very happy to be a member of College Mennonite Church and a member of Mennonite Church USA, with huge indebtedness to some of the voices I hear from Catholicism and from other parts of the Protestant world, and from other of the world religions for that matter. Yes.
If you take a poll of our citizens, would people say that faith and religion unites people or divides people?
Carl's asking, if you take a poll, would people say that religion unites people or divides people? I think that poll would be influenced a bit by the way the public media treats religion. And they like to poke a microphone in front of the most extreme and oftentimes right-wing expressions of religion they can find. And there's clearly a divisive strain there. I talked about backlash in terms of the other awakenings as well. So many people would say, well, this is divisive, and it is. I don't think that that is quite fair to the times when we find it bringing us together. And it's really sort of amazing what a church consists of when you think of the age range, and you think of the educational range, and you think of the economic range. For them to all come together and even sing a hymn together is a kind of a minor miracle. So I don't expect perfection, but I think they're taken overall. My opinion would be there's more uniting going on than there is friction and factionalism. But the friction and factionalism are clearly there, and it goes all the way to hate and exclusion.
I'd be curious what John Littlrock thinks about answering his own question.
John's a thoughtful man. So Phyllis is saying, how would you answer your own question, both the denomination and the local congregation?
Stand up. We can hear.
It's fine for me to stand up. Let me talk this way. Well,
Excuse me. I think there's enough interest in what you're saying. I'm going to bring you the mic.
it's
Well, I sometimes think that maybe we are very near the end of denominationalism, because the traditional churches all across our country are in decline. And what is not in decline are the mega churches. Now, you hear a lot about them, and we have some right here in our own town. They seem to be growing. Now, you might want to ask the question, why are those mega churches growing and the traditional churches are in decline? And I don't know if I have an exact answer to that, because I think maybe an anthropologist or a sociologist like Vic would have maybe a more educated answer to that question. But let me just try a little bit. I think that in our own denomination, we for years were under the guidance of the revival movement in my lifetime. You remember that. We had evangelistic meetings twice a year, and most of our congregations had those kind of meetings. And we had itinerant pastors out doing evangelism. And then we had several outstanding people that spoke for our denomination as far as the revival movement is concerned. Names like George R. Brunk and Howard Hammer, right? B. Charles, name some more. I mean, those were the voices that we grew up with. Myron Augsburger, still living, that one is. But those are the voices we grew up with. And that was the way that we harvested, pardon the language, the young people in our congregations. And that fell by wayside. And we really didn't have a way of bringing the next generation into our congregations. I think that we, right here in this congregation, are a bit guilty of that. We tried by hiring youth ministers, and that worked quite well, but not really like it did in the old revival movement. So that's true now. If the churches that baptize children, that's the way they brought them in, so they had their names on the roll. We baptized the believers, and we didn't have a way of bringing them in. And so most of our grandchildren are not part of the church anymore. Am I overstating that? You need to give me a feedback about that. I see some head shaking, so I'll go on then. Now, it's very difficult how to bring those people into the community of faith. And maybe we need to think differently about that. I know that, like, we lived in Northern Ireland, and there was a Quaker presence in Northern Ireland. And the Quaker presence was not very large in number. They had a Quaker house and 2 or 3. But the Irish people all knew about the Quakers because during the famine, they fed them. The Protestants, what they did is they would feed them if they become Protestants. And so even now in the years we were there, you would ask people's names, and if they had a Catholic name in the Protestant church, they would call them soupers. In other words, they took the soup and joined the church. And that was the way that sort of the Protestant church grew in Northern Ireland, by feeding people rather than having them starve. Now, I think that maybe in our day, maybe people like my son, John Paul, he goes to church, he said in one of the articles sometimes, but he's out every day talking to people on, he can't travel anymore like he did, but he's on the telephone with all people around the world, where he's talking to them about the peace message, what it means to be exceptional in a world that doesn't accept that kind of exceptionality. And I think that's part of our problem, is to know how we're going to move into this new era when we don't have the same structures we had before of propagating ourselves. And maybe we'll be like salt and life in the next generation. I think that my own children and my grandchildren, I think that they're influenced by the peace witness that becomes part of my life, and now it's part of theirs, but they're not part of the structured church. Now, is that the new vision? I don't know. And I just hand the mic back to you, Vic, and let you solve all those problems.
This is an area where it's almost impossible to say anything without a person putting their hand up and saying, but what about? I think about the mega churches. Crystal Cathedral had to be sold. Willow Creek in Illinois is having discontent and had pastoral scandal. So sometimes all is not well with the mega churches. Although I grant you, in this town, out there near the middle school, that church needs 3 services a Sunday to get everybody in. So there are, but it's a mixed kind of picture. In terms of John's very apt comment, are we thinking hard about how we attract our own sons and daughters, our own grandchildren? I think his challenge deserves a lot of careful thought by a lot of people. Well, I think we've about come to the end of our time. I appreciate so much the insights that you have shared. And now, for the first time in a number of weeks, I'm glad to move on to some other topic, somewhat maybe more inspiring than the decline of churches and of Christian faith. I do want to say this about the inescapable topic that comes to us every day, the terrible tragedy and blatant evil of what is going on in Israel, Palestine. That is just so bad. But I'm thankful, maybe I just pass this along as something you might think about. How do you pray when you're faced with that kind of persistent and seemingly growing use of violent force and people die every day? I think of what Paul taught in the book of Romans chapter 8. And he anticipated there are some things so complex and so difficult you don't know how to pray for them. And then he said, the Spirit will take your intentions, your longing, your protest, your outraged feelings, and turn them into a prayer. And that's what I do when I think about that situation. I invite you to follow the wisdom of the Apostle Paul. Thank you so much.